I'm now moving to the death of Ellis W. Ruley. He died in 1959. At the time, he was living alone. Wilhelmina had left him. His great-granddaughters were no longer living with him. He passed away in January of '59, and I'm going to read from the medical examiner report of Dr. George Gildersleeve, who was the town medical examiner at that time of Ellis Ruley's death. The body of this man was found on January 17th, 1959 at about 8:30 a.m. by Richard Johnson, who lives on the upper end of Hammond Avenue. The body was lying in the road at the point where a pathway extends up to the house where the deceased lived alone. Along the sides of the lower pathway were evidences of blood and signs of numerous falls which the dead man had taken. It was ascertained by the police that there was no body in the road earlier in the evening when someone had driven up the road to discharge a passenger. Investigation also showed that this man had been drinking at a tavern in Norwich on the night before his body was discovered. Apparently, on arriving home in an intoxicated condition, he had fallen numerous times in his effort to climb up the path to his house and had finally collapsed, with death resulting from exposure to cold. The death was also investigated by Coroner Edward McKay and the Norwich City Police. I'm now going to discuss what's in the Norwich, Connecticut Bulletin Records article on Ellis Ruley's death. It's an excellent article. It's better, in my opinion, than the medical examiner's report. It was published Sunday, January 18th, 1959. Quote, "The partially frozen body of Ellis Ruley, 77-year-old resident of Hammond Avenue, was found on the road about 200 feet from his house Saturday morning. Coroner Edward McKay expressed the opinion that Ruley, who lived alone, apparently fell Friday night while walking either to or from his home, injured his head and collapsed in the road. His death was ruled accidental by the coroner. Dr. George Gildersleeve said the man apparently died from exposure, although he lost considerable blood from a gash on the head. Dr. Gildersleeve made it clear that the autopsy showed no evidence of violence. Ruley's body, lying on its right side, was first spotted at 8:30 a.m. by Richard Johnson on the lightly traveled portion of the road, often referred to as the extension. Johnson, a resident of the so-called extension, was driving away from his home when he made the discovery. The subsequent investigation revealed that Ruley apparently stumbled in the dark while walking either to or from his home and struck his head against a stone wall. Ruley, judging from a trail of blood extending for a distance of nearly 100 feet, attempted to regain his feet but apparently lost all sense of direction. Stones in the wall were splattered with blood, and it appeared that Ruley then staggered or stumbled in a circle and down a grade back onto the Hammond Road extension, where he collapsed. All along the way, the ground was marked with blood, and midway, the man lost his hat. When he was found, there was blood on the side of Ruley's head where it was gashed. His clothing was frozen stiff. When police checked Ruley's home, they found a padlock on the front door and nothing to indicate whether or not he had been home before he met his death. They did remove a small dog from the premises, which barked constantly as they approached the house. I'm going to refer to the map of the property for just a second. Here you see the driveway, and if you go up the driveway, there's no guardrail right after the hairpin turn. It is possible that Ruley walked up the driveway and stepped off after hitting his head, and then stepped off the left-hand side of the driveway where he would have stumbled back to the road. And you'll notice that there's not a body representing where Ruley was found. That's because in forensic science, if you're going to indicate the location of the body, it's a result of measuring precisely where it is, rather than saying, oh, I think it's over here. The best indications I have from the various supporting materials is he was found very close to where the entrance to his driveway was. I'm going to now move back to the Bulletin article. Sergeant Burns and Officer Kean, in a subsequent investigation, learned that Ruley had been to the Hub restaurant on West Main Street early Friday evening. He left the place in a taxi cab at 7 p.m., was driven to Hammond Avenue, and helped to within 25 feet of his home by the cab driver. Police learned in the course of their questioning that Ruley had been drinking Friday evening. Two of Ruley's neighbors told the investigating officers that they had been over the road at about 7:30 p.m. Friday night and that there was no sign of Ruley at the time. One was Richard Johnson, the other was Paul Schlau. Because of the condition of the body when it was found, Ruley appeared to have met his death Friday night. His body, according to investigating officers, must have been exposed to the weather for some time before it was finally discovered. I'm now going to refer you to a picture which comes from the Norwich Bulletin, which shows the death scene involving Ellis Ruley. Take a look at the ground. You'll see it's a gravel and sand or dirt road. He's near the side of the road. Notice how you have a whole bunch of civilians standing around his body. This would not be allowed in present-day police investigation, but it was Norwich, 1959. You can see the police officer off to the side lighting a cigarette. Take a look. You'll see that there is no apparent snow on the ground. You can't tell if there was ice on the ground. It may have been because at the time Ruley's body was discovered, it was under 20 degrees. It had gone from being a rainy night the previous evening to being well below freezing in the early morning hours of January 17th, 1959. I've often shown this picture around, and no, I don't know whose car that was in the background. The medical examiner position in Norwich was typically taken by a doctor who had a full-time medical practice, and this was not their full-time job. So when it came time for an autopsy, Dr. Gildersleeve decided he was going to send Ellis Ruley up to what is now Windham Hospital for a proper autopsy done by a pathologist. Not a forensic pathologist, but a pathologist. They were not, forensic pathology did not, in the US, did not have its first recognized fellows until 1959, and they certainly weren't in Norwich, Connecticut. In his medical examiner report, Dr. Gildersleeve estimated Ruley's death as occurring between 9 and 10 p.m. This is an unreliable estimate. He would have no way to come to that conclusion based on the tools at his disposal. Ellis Ruley may have died at that time, but I'm just simply saying that, for him to say between 9 and 10 p.m. was a wild guess. Ellis's autopsy was performed by a doctor named Murray Z. Rosenberg. It was started at 2:30 p.m. It was requested by Gildersleeve and Coroner McKay. Only about 4% of people who the town medical examiner looked at ended up getting full medical autopsies. So this would tend to indicate that Gildersleeve and McKay were suspicious of the circumstances of Ellis Ruley's death. I'm now going to read from the autopsy report. External examination of the body. The body was that of an elderly Negro male clothed in outdoor clothing, including an army-type olive drab overcoat, a heavy sweater, shirt, woolen underwear. The clothing was saturated with water and partly solidly frozen, particularly over the lower extremities. The socks and shoes were frozen to the feet. The fingers were clenched and covered with a fine sand. There was hyperextensibility of the finger joints and ulnar deviation of the fingers. Advanced rigor mortis was present, and the body tissues were all much colder than room temperature. This would being the room temperature of the room where the autopsy was done. A black cord attached to which two keys and a plastic crucifix hung loosely about the neck. Important to note, there was no reference to any other personal possessions being found on Ellis Ruley's body. External signs of violence. A 2-centimeter laceration was present over the left temple, and there was swelling of the tissues beneath this laceration. Red blood adherent to the left side of the face, and the left lapel of the overcoat was saturated with blood. Internal examination of the body. A strong ethanolic odor was noted in all body tissues, and a thin fluid was present in the stomach having a ethanolic odor. The intestines were devoid of food or other significant contents. The heart was enlarged, but there was no evidences of heart failure. There was no fractures to the skull or evidence of recent injury to the brain. There was marked arteriosclerosis of the cerebral arteries, and an old infarct of the cerebellum was discovered. This was from Ellis Ruley's auto accident in the late 1920s, I believe. The remainder of the examination of his internal organs was essentially negative. Conclusion: as a result of the gross anatomical findings and pending the report of the State Toxicology Laboratory on blood alcohol concentration, I am of the opinion that death was due to exposure to cold and acute alcoholism. The laceration of the forehead and blood could have been the result of a fall. An issue I have with the work the pathologist did in Ellis Ruley's death was he concluded that alcoholism was a contributing factor, and that was obviously based on what he found in the digestive system, but he didn't have the toxicology report. He didn't know what Ellis's blood alcohol level was. That came back 3 days later after the report was finished. The toxicology report from the Connecticut State Department of Health dated January 22nd, 1959, the decedent's blood alcohol content was 0.14. During his City Hall presentation in 2015, Dr. Baden said the following.
In putting together all the findings of the autopsy report and the external examination we did, and the x-rays and the examination of the skeleton, that he did die of exposure and hypothermia because he was found on the driveway near to his house in very cold weather. He was frozen, and a proper term would be as if somebody dies in the snow sometimes in the woods or something. If the temperature of the body goes low enough, below 80 degrees, we're normally 96, the heart can't beat properly and you die. And then you lay there and get cold and freeze, but you die before you freeze. So that I think, in my best judgment, that Ellis Ruley's death could have occurred if he had collapsed because of some cardiac abnormality from his coronary artery disease or from stroke from his brain disease, or he could have been pushed and he could have been robbed and fought with people because of the blood spatter in the area that were described by the police and the responding police. He fell to the ground and he froze to death, in a sense. How he fell to the ground, whether somebody pushed him, punched him, or whether he died of just a natural collapse just because of a natural condition, we can't tell 55 years later. And also the information about the blood and the wallet comes from sources at the time and afterwards that people's memories can always be affected at the passage of time. But there was a lot of blood present. There was enough blood that the police noted that in their reports. So I think, as far as my opinions with Ellis Ruley, the proper diagnosis is exposure and hypothermia, but that the manner of death, natural accident, suicide, homicide, and the fifth one, if it doesn't fit, is undetermined, would be undetermined. We just can't tell what triggered off his fall.
A concern has been raised by multiple people asking, why was Ellis Ruley's pants found soaked and then frozen solid when he was brought to autopsy? This has been seen as evidence of a suspicious death. The first thing to know is that on the night he returned home, it had been raining the whole day. Weather records indicate that it had started raining about 1 to 2 a.m. Friday morning, and it didn't end until between 7 and 8 p.m., and Ellis Ruley would have arrived home somewhere in that time window. It might have been drizzling a little bit. Some climatologists I talked to raised the issue that had Ruley remained upright, he should have never gotten soaked. because the rain was tailing off. It is possible that when he started to fall and started to crawl and he was having problems, he may have gone through a puddle or may have gone through some sort of minor running water source. And that's how his pants got soaked. And he was later found frozen. The temperature went from 34 degrees the night he returned home to about 18 degrees when his body was found. However, without death scene photographs, I can't establish this to be the case.